The sun rose over the Dragoon Mountains the same way it had for 1,000 years, a merciless blade of light that sliced across the horizon and set the dry earth ablaze. For Arthur, it was just another Tuesday. He felt the light on his eyelids before he opened them, the familiar heat, a summons to a day of labor that was as predictable as the sunrise itself. He swung his legs out of the creaking bed, his feet finding the cool, worn floorboards of the small cabin he had built with his own 2 hands. His life was a litany of routines. First, the well. The rhythmic squeal of the pulley was the day's first song, a lonely melody answered only by the lowing of his small herd of cattle. Then came the livestock, the chickens to be fed, the 2 horses to be checked on. Each task was performed with an economy of motion born of years of repetition. There was no wasted energy, no joy, just the grim satisfaction of survival. He was a man etched by the land he worked. At 44, his hair was more salt than pepper, and the sun had carved deep lines around his eyes and at the corners of his mouth. But his shoulders were broad, and his hands, though calloused and scarred, were steady and strong. It was a strength he no longer knew the purpose of, beyond the simple act of enduring. The cabin was too quiet. The silence had been a comfort once, a shared peace with his wife, Marion. Now it was an entity in itself, a heavy blanket that smothered every sound, every thought. 5 years. 5 years since the fever had taken her, and the silence had moved in to stay. As he worked, mending a fence post that had been loosened by a stubborn bull, he felt it, a prickling on the back of his neck, the kind of feeling that told a man he was no longer alone. He didn't tense, didn't reach for the Winchester leaning against the nearby wagon. He simply stopped his hammering and slowly, deliberately, turned his head. She was standing at the edge of his property line, near a cluster of mesquite trees, as still as a desert hawk, an Apache woman. She wasn't a girl, but age was impossible to guess in a face that seemed carved from the landscape itself. She wore a simple buckskin dress, worn and patched, and her dark hair was tied back with a leather strip. Her feet were in moccasins that looked as tired as the rest of her, but it was her eyes that held him. They were dark, intelligent, and unnervedly direct. She wasn't looking at him with fear or aggression, but with a calm, assessing curiosity, the way a craftsman might study a piece of wood before deciding its use. They stood like that for a long minute, a silent tableau under the vast, indifferent sky. He was a white man on land that had once been hers. She was a ghost from a past that refused to die. Every instinct, every story he'd ever heard, screamed at him to raise his rifle. She was a threat, a harbinger of trouble he had spent years avoiding. But he saw the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders, a weariness that went deeper than muscle. He saw the faint tremor in her hand. He saw a human being standing on cracked earth under a brutal sun. And in a moment of impulse that felt foreign and reckless, he laid his hammer down. He gave a slow, deliberate nod of his head, a gesture meant to convey peace, and walked back towards the well. He drew a fresh bucket of cold, clear water and filled a tin dipper. Holding it out, he walked slowly toward her. He stopped a good 10 feet away, setting the dipper on a large, flat rock that marked the corner of his land. Then he backed away, returning to his porch, and sat down on the top step, watching. She did not move for another full minute. Her eyes darted from the dipper to him, her gaze weighing his intentions. Finally, with a fluid grace that belied her apparent exhaustion, she moved forward. She knelt by the rock, picked up the dipper, and drank. She drank deeply, thirstily, her throat working. When she was finished, she placed the empty dipper back on the rock and looked at him again. There was no gratitude in her expression, nor was there suspicion. There was only acknowledgement. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. She didn't leave. She simply found a spot in the shade of the mesquite trees and sat, her back straight, watching the world with a patience Arthur could only marvel at. As dusk settled, he felt another strange compulsion. He went inside, cut a thick slice of bread from the loaf he'd baked 2 days prior, added a piece of salted beef, and took it out to the rock along with the refilled dipper. He retreated to his porch once more. She ate with the same deliberate purpose she did everything else. When she was done, she rose. Arthur expected her to melt back into the wilderness from which she'd come. Instead, she walked calmly toward his barn. She paused at the wide-open door, looked back at him one last time, and then disappeared inside. Arthur sat on his porch until the stars were scattered like salt across the black sky. He was a man who had built his life on a foundation of control and solitude. In a single afternoon, this silent woman had breached his defenses without a single word. He should have been angry or afraid. Instead, he just felt less alone. He eventually went inside, barred the door to his cabin, and lay down in his empty bed, listening to the unfamiliar sound of another living soul breathing on his property. He awoke to the smell of his own coffee. He shot up in bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. The scent was unmistakable, strong, black and brewing, but he hadn't made it. He grabbed the old Colt Peacemaker from his nightstand and moved silently into the main room, and there she was. She was standing by his cast-iron stove, tending to the coffee pot, as if she'd been doing it every morning for years. She had found the beans, the grinder, the water. The early morning light filtered through the single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and casting her in a soft, almost domestic glow. She looked up as he entered, her face impassive. She gestured with her chin toward the table, where 2 tin mugs were already set. He slowly lowered the pistol, a profound sense of the surreal washing over him. He had spent 5 years in this cabin, and not another soul had stepped foot inside. Now this stranger was making him breakfast. He holstered the Colt and sat down heavily at the table. She poured the coffee, her movements efficient and quiet, and placed a mug in front of him. She took the other for herself and sat opposite him. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was a shared silence, filled with the aroma of coffee and the unspoken questions that hung in the air between them. He took a sip. It was good coffee, strong, just the way he liked it. He watched her over the rim of his mug. She wasn't drinking, just holding the warm mug in her hands, her gaze fixed on him. Her dark eyes seemed to see right through the weathered exterior to the hollow man beneath. He was about to break the silence, to ask her name, to ask what she wanted, when she spoke first. Her voice was lower than he expected, and raspy from disuse, yet it held a clear, resonant quality. Her English was clipped, precise, each word chosen with care. "You are a man who works the earth," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "You make things grow." Arthur nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. "I'm a farmer," he said, his own voice sounding rough to his ears. She nodded, her gaze unwavering. She seemed to be considering his words, his face, the very air around him. The moment stretched, filled with a tension he couldn't name. Then, with a sincerity so direct and devoid of any guile that it was utterly disarming, she asked the question that would shatter his world. "Do you know how to make babies?" The hot coffee hit the back of Arthur's throat, and his entire respiratory system seized. He choked, a violent sputtering cough that brought tears to his eyes. The liquid spewed from his mouth, splashing across the rough-hewn table. He gasped for air, his face turning a shade of crimson he hadn't felt since he was a teenager. He stared at her, utterly speechless, his mind a complete and total blank. She simply sat there, watching him with the same calm, patient intensity, waiting for an answer. The world seemed to shrink to the small space between them at the rough-hewn table. Arthur's coughing subsided, leaving him red-faced and gasping, his heart thudding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock. embarrassment, and utter bewilderment. Logan simply watched him, her expression unchanged. There was no mockery in her eyes, no hint of a smirk on her lips. She held his gaze with the same unnerving stillness, as if his violent reaction was just another curious behavior of this strange white man. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture that conveyed genuine confusion. "Did I use the wrong words?" she asked, her voice calm and even. Arthur finally found his breath. He shook his head, unable to form a coherent sentence. He was a man who prized order and predictability, and this woman had just taken a stick of dynamite to the quiet, dusty structure of his life. He took a long, slow breath, forcing himself to think past the heat rising in his collar. This was not a flirtation. It was not a proposition from a saloon girl. The question had been delivered with the same gravity as asking about planting corn or finding water. It was a practical inquiry. He cleared his throat, the sound raw and loud in the quiet cabin. "That's not a question you just ask a man," he managed to say, his voice strained. "Why?" she asked, the single word cutting through all of his ingrained social rules. How could he explain? How could he articulate the decades of unspoken codes, of propriety and private matters, to someone whose world was clearly governed by a different set of truths? He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw past the shocking words to the deep, abiding seriousness in her eyes. There was a story there, and he realized he had to understand it. "Why do you want to know?" he asked, his voice softer now, more curious than accusatory. She held his gaze for a long moment before answering. "My husband, Tokala, walked the Spirit Road 2 winters ago. The coughing sickness took him. Many of our people are gone. The children are few." She placed a hand on her flat stomach, a gesture of profound and simple meaning. A woman's purpose is to bring forth life, to keep the fire of her people from going out. I am strong. I can carry a child. But I cannot make one alone. The air left Arthur's lungs again, but this time it was not from shock, it was from the weight of her words. He suddenly felt foolish, his face burning with a different kind of shame. He had been flustered by a matter of etiquette while she was speaking of the survival of her entire people. Her question hadn't been about desire. It had been about legacy, about a future she was desperately trying to secure against a tide of death and loss. He thought of Marion, of the child they had always wanted but never had. He understood, in a way that tightened his chest with a familiar ache, the deep, primal need she was expressing. He looked down at his calloused hands, resting on the table, hands that knew how to mend fences, till soil, and deliver a calf, but were helpless in the face of such a raw human need. I can't," he said, the words feeling inadequate and clumsy. "It's not that simple." She nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer. "Nothing is simple," she agreed. She finally took a sip of her coffee, her first, and the shared, simple act seemed to diffuse the last of the tension. The crisis had passed, leaving behind a fragile, new understanding. They finished their coffee in a silence that was no longer uncomfortable. It was thoughtful. When they were done, Logan stood and carried the mugs to the wash basin, moving about his cabin with a quiet familiarity that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. That day, a new routine began. She did not leave. Arthur went about his chores, and she observed. When he struggled to track a coyote that had been harassing his chickens, she picked up the trail with an ease that humbled him. She moved through the brush like a shadow, pointing out signs he had completely missed. By nightfall, the coyote was dealt with, and his chickens were safe. A few days later, he stood staring at the creek that watered his small pasture. The flow was weaker than it should be for this time of year, a trickle of its former self. It was his lifeline. Without it, his cattle would die, and his farm would wither. Logan joined him, her gaze following his up the dry, rocky creek bed. "The water is tired," she said. "It's drying up," he corrected grimly. She shook her head. "No, it is blocked, lazy. I will wake it up." The next morning she was gone before sunrise. Arthur felt a pang of something he refused to name, disappointment. He told himself it was for the best. Complications were gone, but the silence in the cabin felt heavier than before. He was halfway through his morning chores when he heard it, a distant rumble, then a shout. He grabbed his Winchester and ran toward the sound, his mind racing with images of rock slides or ambushes. He found her a half-mile upstream, standing beside a newly collapsed beaver dam, her clothes soaked, leaning on a long, sturdy branch she had used as a lever. The creek, freed from its prison, was gushing past her, a muddy but powerful torrent rushing down to his pasture. She had single-handedly found and dismantled the blockage that would have ruined him. She looked up at him, a rare, small smile touching her lips. "The water is awake now," she said. From that day on, an unspoken partnership was forged. She knew the land in a way he never could. She showed him which plants were medicine and which were poison, how to read the clouds for a coming storm, and where the deer came to drink at dusk. In return, he provided what he had: a solid roof, a steady supply of flour and coffee, and a safe distance from a world that had become hostile to her. They rarely spoke of personal matters, but a language of shared tasks and mutual respect grew between them. The gaping silence of his life began to fill with the quiet sounds of her presence. About 2 weeks after her arrival, he hitched his wagon for a trip to the nearby town of Redemption for supplies. Lawson watched him from the porch. "I will come," she said. It was not a request. Arthur hesitated. "It's not safe for you." "Being alone is not safe," she countered, and he could not argue with her logic. Redemption was a dusty collection of false-fronted buildings baking under the Arizona sun. As Arthur guided the wagon down the main street, he felt the eyes on them. Whispers followed them like flies. A woman like Lawson was a rare sight, and her presence beside a solitary man like Arthur was fuel for rampant gossip. He kept his face a mask of indifference, focusing on his list of supplies at the general store. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of pickles, leather, and dust. As Arthur was paying for his goods, a large, florid man with a booming voice and a stained waistcoat entered. It was Horace, his closest neighbor, a man whose ranch sprawled across the valley and whose ambition was even bigger. "Well, well, Arthur," Horace bellowed, slapping him hard on the back. "Stocking up, I see. Times must be good if you're buying 2 sacks of flour." His eyes flickered past Arthur to the wagon outside, where Lawson sat as still and proud as a queen on a throne. A greasy smile spread across Horace's face. "Or perhaps you've got company." "Just getting what I need, Horace," Arthur said, his voice level, refusing to take the bait. "Is that so?" Horace leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough for half the store to hear. "Heard you were harboring a stray. You ought to be careful, Arthur. You let one of them onto your land, the next thing you know, the whole tribe thinks they've got an invitation. They bring trouble, sickness." He winked. "And the sheriff doesn't take kindly to folks who consort with savages." Arthur felt a cold knot of anger tighten in his stomach. He looked at Horace's smug face, at the casual cruelty in his eyes. He saw the glances from the other men in the store, a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. He simply picked up his sacks of flour, one under each arm, and walked out without another word. The silence he left behind was more damning than any argument. The ride back to the farm was quiet. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the road. Arthur could feel the weight of Horace's words, the poison of them seeping into the fragile peace he had begun to build. He had invited this woman into his world, and now, he realized, he had also invited the world's hatred to his doorstep. He glanced at Lowe's. She was looking straight ahead, her profile etched against the setting sun, her expression unreadable. But he knew she had heard. She had understood everything. His quiet life was over. A storm was coming, and she was at the center of it. Horace's poison worked faster than snakebite. The change was not in shouted slurs or open threats, but in 1,000 small, cold gestures. The next time Arthur went to town, the blacksmith, a man he'd known for 10 years, was suddenly too busy to re-shoe his horse. At the general store, old Mr. Abernathy, who usually saved a piece of licorice for him, suddenly couldn't meet his eye and fumbled his change. Men who once nodded a greeting now found something fascinating to study on the other side of the street. The women of redemption, who had once offered him quiet sympathy after Marion's passing, now pulled their children a little closer and whispered behind their hands as he passed. He and Lowe's were an island, and the sea of public opinion was turning cold and hostile around them. He felt the pressure like a physical weight. Every night he'd sit by the fire, cleaning his rifle, wondering if he was doing the right thing. He was a man who had courted solitude, but this was different. This was exile. He would look over at Loenum, who would be mending a tear in her buckskin dress, or sharpening a small knife with a whetstone, her face a mask of serene concentration. Did she feel it? Of course she did. She was a woman who could sense a shift in the wind. She could certainly sense a shift in the hearts of men, yet she never spoke of it. Her silence was a challenge, a testament to a resilience that shamed his own anxieties. He had offered her shelter, but it was she who was teaching him about strength. One afternoon, he found tracks near the northern fence line. A single rider. The hoofprints were fresh. The man had sat on his horse for a long time, just watching the cabin. The tracks led back in the direction of Horace's ranch. It was a warning, a reminder that they were being watched. A cold dread settled in Arthur's gut. Horace wasn't just a gossip. He was a vulture, circling, waiting for a sign of weakness. The weakness came in the form of the sky. For a week it had been a brassy, unforgiving bowl of heat. Then one afternoon, a bruised purple line appeared on the western horizon. It advanced with unnatural speed, swallowing the blue sky. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a strange electric stillness. The birds fell silent. "A bad storm is coming," Lozan said, her voice low. She stood on the porch, sniffing the air like an animal. "The wind will have teeth." Arthur had seen storms like this before. They could drop a year's worth of rain in a single hour and carry winds that could tear the roof off a barn. They worked with a frantic urgency, securing the shutters, bringing the chickens into the barn, and checking the tethers on the horses. The sky grew darker by the minute, the world painted in an eerie, greenish light. Just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, Arthur made one last run to the pasture to drive the small herd of cattle closer to the relative shelter of a rocky outcrop. That's when he saw it. The fence wasn't just down, it was cut. 3 thick strands of barbed wire, snipped clean through with wire cutters. It was no accident, no act of a spooked animal. It was sabotage, cold, calculated, and timed perfectly with the coming storm. A wave of fury, so hot and potent it almost made him dizzy, washed over him. Horace. The sky opened up. The rain came down, not in drops, but in a solid, blinding sheet. The wind shrieked, tearing at his clothes. Through the deluge, he saw the last of his cattle, terrified by the thunder that cracked like a celestial whip, stampeding through the gap in the fence and disappearing into the maelstrom. His entire livelihood scattered to the 4 winds. He stumbled back to the barn, soaked to the bone, the fury draining out of him and leaving a cold, hard stone of despair in its place. He was ruined. Horace had won. Lozan was waiting for him, her face grim in the lantern light. He didn't have to say a word. She looked past him, into the storm, and then back at the defeat in his eyes. "They are not gone," she said, her voice cutting through the roar of the wind. "They are just lost. We will find them." In this, Arthur gestured wildly at the raging storm. "It's impossible. They could be miles away by now, scattered from here to the mountains." She walked to the two horses, who were shifting nervously in their stalls. She began to saddle them with a calm, methodical purpose. "The storm will pass. The tracks will be fresh in the mud. The land remembers. I remember." Her certainty was a lifeline. Shamed by his own despair, he took a deep breath and began to saddle the other horse. They rode out, as the storm began to break, into a world washed clean and battered. The ground was a slick, treacherous morass of mud, but Loza seemed to read it like a book. She dismounted, her eyes scanning the ground. While Arthur saw only a chaotic mess of tracks, she saw a story. "3 went this way toward the rocks," she said, pointing. "The big bull and 2 others ran south along the wash. They are frightened. They will not go far. For the next 2 days they lived in the saddle." Luzan's skill was nothing short of miraculous. She could tell by the depth of a hoofprint how tired an animal was. She could see where a branch was broken 70 yards away and know that a steer had passed that way. She led him through canyons and across mesas he never knew existed, slowly, painstakingly gathering his herd. They were partners in a way they had never been before, a silent, efficient team bound by a singular purpose. On the evening of the second day, with only 2 steers left to find, the sky turned against them again. A cold, biting rain began to fall, and the temperature plummeted. They were miles from home, exhausted and chilled to the bone. "We must find shelter," Lozan said, her teeth chattering slightly. She pointed toward a dark cleft in a rock face a few hundred yards away. There, a cave. It was small, barely more than an overhang, but it was dry. They built a small, smoky fire from the driest wood they could find, and huddled close to its meager warmth. The rain fell in a steady, miserable curtain outside, sealing them in their tiny sanctuary. Arthur passed her his half-empty canteen and a piece of hardtack from his saddlebag. She looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. The mask of impassivity was gone, replaced by a deep weariness. He saw a small healing cut on her cheek where a branch had whipped her. Without thinking, he reached out and gently brushed his thumb over it. Her skin was soft. She flinched, not in fear but in surprise, her eyes widening slightly. His hand froze for a second before he pulled it back as if he'd been burned. The space between them crackled with a new kind of tension, something far more potent than the storm outside. "Thank you," he said, his voice husky. "I would have lost everything. Everything. Double quotes he didn't know how to finish. "It is our land now," she said softly. "Our cattle. We protect what is ours. Ours asterisk." The word hung in the air between them, simple and profound. In that moment she wasn't an Apache, and he wasn't a white man. They were just 2 people, huddled together against the cold, who had found something in each other that they had both thought long lost. He looked at her, at the strength in her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, the unexpected softness of her skin, and felt a fierce, protective surge in his chest that had nothing to do with land or cattle. They found the last 2 steers the next morning. As they drove the weary herd home, Arthur was a changed man. The despair was gone, burned away by the fire in the cave, and replaced with a cold, hard resolve. Horace hadn't just cut his fence, he had attacked his home. He had threatened Lozan, and that was a line he would not allow anyone to cross. He didn't even stop to change his mud-caked clothes. After securing the herd, he got back on his horse and rode straight for redemption. He found what he was looking for at the saloon. Harvey, one of Horace's most loyal and loud-mouthed ranch hands, was holding court at the bar. Arthur pushed through the bat-wing doors, the whole saloon falling silent at the sight of him. He walked straight up to Harvey, who turned with a drunken smirk on his face. "Look what the storm dragged in," Harvey sneered. "Thought you'd be halfway to California by now, Arthur." Arthur didn't say a word. He reached out, grabbed the front of Harvey's shirt, and slammed him back against the bar so hard that bottles rattled. He leaned in close, his voice a low, dangerous growl that cut through the silence. "Go back to your master," Arthur said, his eyes like chips of ice. "You tell Horace that my fence is mended. You tell him that my cattle are home. And you tell him that if he, or any of his dogs, ever set foot on my land again, I will consider it a threat to my home and my family, and I will answer it with lead." He shoved Harvey away and turned his back on him. He walked out of the saloon, leaving a stunned and silent room behind him. The battle was no longer in the shadows. He had just declared war. Arthur rode back from redemption with a straight back and a clear mind. The fear that had gnawed at him for weeks had been replaced by the cold, clean certainty of a man who had chosen his ground. He was no longer just defending a piece of land. He was defending a future, one he hadn't even realized he wanted until it was threatened. When he saw the cabin, with a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney into the twilight, a feeling he could only name as *as home* settled in his chest, profound and powerful. Lawson was waiting on the porch, a rifle resting across her lap. She had seen him coming from a mile away. Her eyes searched his face as he dismounted, reading the story of what had happened in town. She saw the new hardness in his jaw, the resolve in his gaze. She gave a single slow nod. No words were needed. They were in this together. The line had been drawn, not in the dust, but in their hearts. The days that followed were tense. Arthur worked with a rifle, always within reach. Lawson moved like a ghost along the edges of the property, her senses alive to any change, any unfamiliar sound. But Horace did not send his men. There was no direct retaliation. Instead, a more insidious attack began. The creek, which had run full and strong after the storm, began to dwindle again. Within a week, it was back to a pathetic trickle, even lower than before. "This is not the work of beavers," Lawson said one morning. Her brow furrowed as she stared at the damp, cracked earth of the creek bed. "The land does not heal, and then sicken again so quickly. Something is bleeding the water away upstream." On Horace's land, Arthur finished, the pieces clicking into place. This was the real plan. Not a stampede, not intimidation, starvation. He meant to kill the farm by thirst, forcing Arthur to sell for pennies on the dollar. It was clever, cruel, and nearly impossible to fight. "We will see this thing," Lawson stated, her chin set with determination. Under the cover of a moonless night, they rode out not as farmers, but as scouts. They followed the dying creek bed upstream, crossing the unmarked boundary onto Horace's vast property. They moved in silence, the horses' hooves muffled by the soft earth. After nearly an hour, Lawson held up a hand, signaling a halt. Arthur could hear it now, the sound of digging, the low murmur of men's voices. They tethered the horses and crept forward on foot, using the rocks and brush for cover. In a narrow section of the canyon, they saw it. A team of Horace's men were working by lantern light, building a large permanent diversion dam out of rock and timber. They were creating a new channel, one that would divert the entire flow of the creek westward, toward Horace's own thirsty pastures, leaving Arthur's land to bake and die. Arthur felt the familiar hot rage, but Lawson's cool hand on his arm restrained him. She pointed. Lying near a pile of discarded timbers was a heavy-duty axe. Even in the dim light, Arthur recognized the unique, hand-forged brand on the handle, a large H with a slash through it. It was Horace's mark, one he put on all his tools, his cattle, his very world. "Proof," Lawson whispered. They watched for another hour, memorizing the faces, the scale of the operation. This was no small act of sabotage. It was a major, illegal engineering project. When they finally slipped away into the darkness, Arthur knew what he had to do. Another confrontation in a saloon would achieve nothing. This required a different kind of weapon. The next morning, they rode into Redemption again. But this time, they didn't stop at the general store. They went straight to the small office of Sheriff Miller, a man whose weary posture suggested he preferred paperwork to gunfights. The sheriff listened, his face impassive, as Arthur laid out the story. He steepled his fingers, his gaze flickering toward Lozan, stood silently by Arthur's side, her presence a powerful, unspoken statement. "That's a serious accusation, Arthur," Miller said, his tone skeptical. "Horace is an important man in this county. You have any proof? Or is this just a squabble between neighbors?" "I have the truth," Arthur said, his voice steady, "and I have a witness. But if you want proof you can hold, ride with us. See the dam he's building with your own eyes. It's on his land, yes, but it's stealing water that's fed my property for 50 years. That's a crime." Just then, the door to the office swung open, and Horace himself strode in, a confident smirk on his face. He'd clearly been told of their arrival. "Sheriff," he boomed, "I hope you're not wasting your time with this man's paranoid fantasies. He's been acting strangely for weeks, ever since he took up with her." He waved a dismissive hand in Luzan's direction. "He says you're diverting the creek, Horace," the sheriff said, his eyes narrowed. Horace laughed, a loud, artificial sound. "That creek? It's on my land. I can do with it as I please. Besides, it's practically dry. Farmer's just looking for someone to blame for his own failures. It's dry because you're killing it." Arthur shot back, his voice ringing with conviction. "You cut my fence to scatter my herd, and when that didn't work, you decided to choke my land to death." The commotion had drawn a crowd. People were gathering outside the sheriff's office, peering in the windows. Horace, ever the performer, stepped out onto the boardwalk, raising his voice for all to hear. "This man is a liar," he declared. "He's making these wild accusations because he's failed as a rancher and needs a scapegoat. He brings this savage onto his land, turns his back on his own kind, and now he wants to blame me for his problems." But something in Horace's bluster didn't ring true. The people of Redemption had seen Arthur's quiet dignity for years. They had also seen Horace's greed. They looked at Arthur, standing tall and unbowed. They looked at Loz, who met their stares not with fear or shame, but with a proud, unwavering gaze, and they began to doubt. "If you have nothing to hide, Horace," Arthur said, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmurs, "then you won't mind if the sheriff takes a ride with me to see this dry creek for himself." Horace's face flushed. He was trapped by his own arrogance. To refuse would be an admission of guilt. "Fine," he spat. "Waste the whole day. You'll find nothing." Sheriff Miller, seeing the tide of opinion turning, knew he had to act. He deputized 2 men from the crowd, and the small posse rode out, with Arthur and Lohan leading the way. The discovery of the half-built dam, the fresh tracks, and most damningly, Horace's branded axe left carelessly at the scene, sealed his fate. When the posse returned to town with the evidence, Horace's reign of influence collapsed. He was arrested for theft of water rights and destruction of property. The dam was dismantled, and the clear, life-giving water flowed back to Arthur's land. A hesitant acceptance began to dawn. People saw Loza not as a threat, but as the woman who had stood by Arthur, whose knowledge had saved him. They saw Arthur not as an eccentric recluse, but as a man of courage who had fought for his home. The nods on the street returned. Mr. Abernathy offered him a piece of licorice. It was a start. Weeks later, the rhythm of the farm had returned, but it was a new rhythm, a melody played by 2 instruments instead of 1. One cool morning, Arthur stood on the porch, a mug of coffee in his hands, watching the sunrise paint the mountains. The silence was back, but it was the old silence. The comfortable peace he had shared with Marion, now reborn with Lawson. She came to stand beside him, her presence a warm, solid comfort. She took the mug he offered, their fingers brushing. He looked down at her hand, so capable and strong, and covered it with his own. "Lawson," he began, his voice quiet. "A long time ago you asked me a question I wasn't ready to answer." She turned to him, her dark eyes searching his. "You asked me if I knew how to make babies," he said, a small, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in years. There was no embarrassment now, only a profound tenderness. I think I've been learning the answer. It's not about planting a seed in the ground. It's about building a fence against the storm, together. It's about tracking what's lost, together. It's about finding water in a dry land, together." He turned to face her fully, holding both of her hands in his. "It's about building a life, a home, a family." He looked deep into her eyes, laying his heart bare. "I don't just want to survive anymore, Lawson. I want to live with you. Will you be my wife?" A slow, brilliant smile spread across her face, a sunrise all its own, chasing away the last of the shadows. She didn't need to use words. Her answer was in the light of her eyes, in the way her hands tightened around his. In this quiet corner of the world, two people from different worlds, who had started as strangers, brought together by desperation, had finally found the one thing they both had been searching for, a place to belong. True strength is not found in building walls of solitude, but in having the courage to bridge the divides of culture and prejudice. Love and respect can bloom in the harshest of lands, proving that a shared future, built on mutual understanding, is far more powerful than a divided past. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confirm your subscription and leave a like. It helps us a lot.